Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar on the subject of knowing yourself on all levels. My name's Dr. Sandeep Gupta, and along with Dr. Samantha Clarke, we're going to be your hosts for this webinar. And how are you this evening, Samantha?
Yeah, I'm great. I'm really looking forward to having a chat with everyone and talking about what the retreat's going to look like, but also to share some tips around health and well-being with whoever's listening.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think it's a great topic, and I'm going to start off with just a few little introductory comments, and then after that we'll both introduce ourselves and our background a little bit, and then we're going to jump into answering some questions that have been asked of us through the years, and then if anyone has additional questions, you can just post them in the YouTube comment field, and we'll be able to answer as many of those during this webinar as possible. So really just a few thoughts to start with. And the first thing that came to me when we were organizing this webinar is it's so important that we have a paradigm shift in the way we look at health. And so you'll notice we didn't title this webinar Know Yourself as a Medical Condition or Know Yourself as a psychological syndrome. We said know yourself on all levels. And so the paradigm shift here is that if ultimately you can know yourself well enough on all levels, so physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, the model is, or the theory is in holistic medicine, that that's essentially all you need to do to get well. And any specific disease-oriented approaches are really only secondary to knowing yourself. And so what do we mean by knowing yourself? So we're going to talk about, I'm going to mainly focus on the physical side of this, and Samantha's going to talk a little bit more about the mental and emotional sides of knowing yourself. But really what we mean is that everyone's different, everyone's unique. And if you can come to know your uniqueness and how that all hangs together in terms of your physical being, then you've gone a whole long way towards achieving long-term health, or knowing at least how to move towards achieving long-term health. Samantha, would you like to talk a little bit about how you think that relates to the mental and emotional realms?
Absolutely. So I think that they're so intrinsically linked, your physical health and your psychological health. And we know more and more research is showing us that there is such a strong link between what's happening in your body and how that manifests in your psychology, but also the way that, we think about things or our perspective and how that impacts our health. So when we're thinking about the psychological aspect, we can look at maybe how we sabotage ourselves, or behaviors that we do that are away from wellbeing behaviors. My view is that most people know a lot of things anyway to take care of themselves, but there's reasons why we don't do them. So a big part that I like focusing on is, what are the blocks for people? What are they doing? And what's the function of that problematic behavior that they're doing? And how to actually move people towards being passionate about taking care of themselves so that they can find their meaning and their purpose. So I think that really, if we're looking at identifying the blocks for people, but also what they're passionate about, people are, again, knowing themselves in that way, are going to be more likely to do the behaviors to take good care of themselves.
Right. So you could say, it's almost like you can only overcome something if you're aware of it.
Absolutely.
And I think that's kind of a fundamental principle we're talking about here, that the more you can develop awareness as to all levels of your system, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, the more you become a whole being. And really, that's what holistic health ultimately is aiming towards. And for me, that's a very exciting possibility that each of us can achieve. Sam, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I guess, when we look at self-determination theory in psychology, which is looking at if you can be competent at what you do, if you feel autonomous about the choices that you make and feel connected with your community and people that you love, then that's going to lead you into that sense of well-being. So we can see, if you're knowing yourself well, that you can target those three areas.
Right. And specifically, so during this retreat, which we're going to be talking a little bit more about later on, basically it's going to be called a Practitioner Wellness Retreat. And really what we're going to do is look at how do these principles, which we've started outlining, how do they relate to those of us who are practitioners? And I guess you could say it's a unique kind of vocation, in a sense, when you're a practitioner, in that you really, I think we have the amazing privilege to work with people who are trying to get well. And at the same time, we have our own selves and our own little health journeys in the background. And I think that it kind of brings up a really interesting situation where either we can take motivation from the fact that so many people are coming into us who are wanting to get well, and therefore we can try and on all levels to be achieving health and wellness, or sometimes we can sort of slip into this subtle self-neglect, which can come in due to the fact that we have so many clients or so many patients, and there are just so many demands of life as a practitioner. And I think for me that's going to be a really interesting balance to discuss, and I know that'll be something that'll come up at the retreat as well. Have any thoughts about that, Samantha?
Yes, I think you and I have talked a bit about this at the last retreat, but also just personally, that this is a really tricky balance for us as health practitioners, that often, you know, it is quite meaningful for us to engage with our clients and take care of people, but there can be that really fine line between when that starts becoming like too many people, or we spend too much time in work and we're not doing the things that we need to take care of. So one of the things that's important is really being able to find your number, I say, is one of the things that I like looking at, how many people you can see. And that might vary at different times. So if you're feeling, you know, that everything's going well and you're managing things great, then maybe you might take on more people. But it's really about that sort of moving idea of checking in with yourself, knowing where you're at, and being able to make choices around who you're working with that reflect that. But yeah, I think that, you know, as health professionals, we are very privileged in what we do, but it can also be a really difficult and can be quite a taxing job at the same time. And we need to know how to nurture ourselves. And sometimes when we've gone into the helping role, sometimes that's come from a place of not great modeling. So maybe we've been in a helping role within our family that you and I have talked about, and maybe we're not great at helping ourselves at the same time as helping. So we really want to start making sure that practitioner health at the foreground of what's most important, so that we can take care of the people we work with in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's the really good points. And one thing I've noticed is that, you know, I have certain days where I feel like I'm firing on all cylinders, and some days where I'm like firing on like 1.2 cylinders or something like that. And what I notice is that on those days where I am feeling really well on all levels, like, you know, I've nurtured myself, maybe I've had a green vegetable juice and, you know, ideally had a walk on the beach or something like that, there seems to just be an extra level that comes through in the consultations and in the interactions with clients or patients, almost as if there's more of me.
Yeah.
And it makes it more satisfying. So that's another side to this, I guess, isn't it? This idea of practitioner wellness, that ultimately it's not about us as well. It's about everyone enhancing the experience. Do you have
absolutely? Yeah, you seem to be talking about vitality there, that sense of when you came back into the room, there was more of you there and that you felt more engaged. And that's a big part of the work that I like doing, is how to help people have contact with that sense of vitality. And, you know, on the days where we're not running on all cylinders, are there things that we can do on those days to help, you know, just run a little bit better? So is that like taking a mindful break? Is that, you know, doing a little bit of meditation practice in between our patients? Is it, you know, making sure we walk out in nature and eat our lunch outside? So it's really like knowing yourself is, you know, am I running on 2 cylinders and I'm running on all cylinders, and how can I manage my day based on that?
Right. Yeah, and so I guess again we're going back to awareness and knowing ourselves. So if we have a mechanism as practitioners where we can identify, where am I today? Am I 5 out of 5, or am I running at about 2 out of 5? Well, that's a simple way of thinking about it, isn't it? Then that's also a way in which we can give ourselves some extra care on certain days, so as to to get back closer to that state we'd like to be in, where really we're able to flow a lot better in our consultations and in our communication with clients.
Yeah.
So I think this awareness theme is going to kind of probably keep coming back during today's seminar, and I really like that as kind of the center point for thinking about holistic health.
Yeah.
It's almost as if ultimately that holistic health starts with awareness. And one of the key awarenesses is that we are a whole being. We're not just a physical body. We're not just a disease, firstly.
Yeah.
We're a whole physical body, which is a complicated interplay of so many different parts. We're not just the bit that gets seen by the cardiologist and the other bit that gets seen by the renal physician, and then the other bit that gets seen by the surgeon. Have you seen that that sort of thing play out at all in practice, Samantha, where you have like one specialist is looking after one organ and another one's doing something else, but actually sometimes it's not fitting together at all?
Yeah, I actually think that that's probably the more common experience of when people have come in, particularly if there's a health issue going on, is that there's a lot of different people involved in that person's care and there's not a lot of communication. And again, sort of treating symptoms rather than coming into, what might be the underlying cause of what's going on here. So that's why integrated medicine for me is such a shift into that wellness paradigm rather than that medical model that, is traditionally how we kind of do medicine or even psychology, like being a clinical psychologist. A lot of the perspective is that there's, something problematic rather than, this symptom might be actually linked to something going on underneath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the shift of approach seems to change everything in a sense that when we change a paradigm and we change the way we think about a problem, essentially everything changes. So rather than, I used to, initially when I worked in the hospital, sometimes in the emergency department, we would think of it as, we've got an asthma patient in bed 1, we've got a heart attack in bed 2, we've got a laceration in bed 3. Well, what happened to the person? So if we take it totally away from it, and look, I think that sort of thing has its place in emergencies and so on, and absolutely, we're not bagging conventional medicine here. I mean, it absolutely is an amazing science, particularly for acute severe conditions like heart attacks and other conditions which we see in intensive care units. But it's almost like when we're looking at long-term health and when we're looking at chronic illness, then having this idea of a whole person approach just seems to be so much more satisfying for everyone involved. And because ultimately just using a disease-orientated approach, and using medications and so on, it just doesn't seem to get deep enough to really get the sort of shift that we need in dealing with these long-term problems. Have you had any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think that there's that part, but there's also, when someone's going through a chronic illness, sometimes they need to be in a place where that's going to be around for quite a long time. So how do we still look at who they are as a person and engage that and still help them find meaning and purpose? So one part of the research I did was looking at, how do we actually create meaning and purpose for people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar? And how does that sort of meaning and purpose then lead to greater well-being? So even though their illness didn't change, their sense of who they were and how they moved in the world was completely different.
Great. And your experience of treating these people, did you find that changed as well when your approaches changed?
Yeah, I think that, so for me, it's a lot richer, definitely. And I think that the only way that, for me, of doing the work that we do is to be able to really connect with the person that's in front of us. And, seeing somebody as a condition for me is never really, doesn't feel very rewarding or enriching. Whereas if I can connect with, what's that person's story, what's their experience and where do they want to head, that's much more the way that I like to work.
Great. Okay, I'm going to suggest shifting gears here and maybe just starting to talk a little bit about how Sam and I specifically got into this more holistic approach to health. Would you like to go first, Sam, and maybe talk a little bit about how you got into a more holistic approach to health, and we could just go from there?
Sure. So I traditionally studied as a clinical psychologist, and through that path of clinical psychology, I came across types of models of intervention that included mindfulness. And for me, when I discovered mindfulness, it was really such a shift. It really helped me to be able to step back from my own difficult experiences. So whether that was difficult thoughts that I was having or difficult emotional experiences I was having, there was something that felt like this golden nugget in this mindfulness stuff. So that was my original kind of path, was focusing on mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'm very passionate about and do a lot of work around that. But where things kind of changed for me is maybe about 4 years ago, I went traveling to Thailand. One of my passions, and one of the reasons I love running retreats, is my passion for travel. So I was traveling in Thailand, and I must have, picked up a really horrible parasite when I was there. So I was very, very sick. And when I came back, I didn't realize that I needed to maybe get rid of the parasite. I felt like I felt better, so everything felt like it was okay. And I just started going about my usual work and life experiences. And over that sort of next 6 to 12 months, I started to just feel really, really unwell. And I started to experience anxiety symptoms, like sort of panicky symptoms, feelings of depression. And of course, being the good psychologist that I was, I felt like I would have all the tools to be able to manage that. So I did meditation, I did exercise, I ate really well, I made sure I spent time with really, really helpful people. I did lots and lots of work on myself, but something just still evolving. And luckily I went and saw some good integrative doctors who had talked to me about, maybe there was something else going on, like a parasite, or maybe, mold infections or something like that. And so having seen these, amazing being one of those, we could uncover that there was actually a lot of reasons why my mental health wasn't good, because there were things like mold going on for me and parasites. So it really, for me, just opened me up to, wow, like all the clients that come and see me, and often depression and anxiety is such a common one. And, particularly for people who don't know, like there isn't something going on that's different in their external world, that maybe there's something going on internally. And now I feel so much more aware that linking them with the right person might be able to help them look at the cause for some of those symptoms outside of the sort of psychological realm. So for me, it just sort of created this passion for learning more about integrative medicine. And that's just continued. So the more I've learnt about it, the more I've just integrated those practices into my life, and also sharing those with people that I work with.
Great. Wow. And this has been an ongoing little journey for you, I guess, over the last 20 or so years, I imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can look back in my health, and, now knowing what I know, I can look back and go, okay, there was always something kind of not quite right going on, and I can understand a lot more about myself because of that. So that awareness has really helped me to shift, how I am with my behaviours around my own self-care.
Okay, and so I'll add a little bit about my personal journey. I basically trained also as a conventional medical doctor through the University of Queensland. I was actually in the last year of the 6-year undergraduate training, and I went to it straight from high school. I didn't have any particular altruistic reason for going into medical school. I just thought it would be a challenge, and I was happy that I got in. And really it was almost like just being on a train that took me towards graduation. And then by the time I got out of medical school and headed into the hospital, most of my ideas of holism had been quenched. So when I was going, and I think this happens for most people actually, you go through medical school, you have this idealistic side, and so I was actually into a holistic model of health in medical school, and I read about various holistic models, but when I got to the hospital, really it was a matter of survival. actually. And there was kind of a very strong emphasis on the need for specialist medicine, and there was quite a strong devaluing of general practice in some ways. And so, look, I studied to be a general physician and started down that pathway, and then ended up accepting a position in a private hospital working in intensive care and I worked in that for around 5 years, and working with people who mainly had cardiac surgery, like bypass surgery and so on. But during this time, I had an episode when I was overseas in America where I actually got a gut infection and ended up taking a really strong antibiotic. And as a result of that, I started feeling that my health was just deteriorating. But medically, that really made no sense because I had got rid of the condition. I'd got rid of the infection with the antibiotic. So why should I be feeling fatigued? I should be able to just get back and move on with my life. Mind you, what happened was actually the opposite. I actually was experiencing terrible headaches. I had very low energy levels. I had irritable bowel symptoms. And I had my bowels weren't functioning well at all, and things were just falling apart. And it didn't really make sense under the conventional medical model. And so that led me to start doing my own research and thinking outside the box. And I started thinking about, well, hang on, obviously I must have depleted something which is needed for my health. It wasn't just about the condition. There's actually a sense of underlying balance that must be there. And I started reading about the microbiome, started reading about the idea that we can actually deplete that and get an inflamed gut, which can then lead to a whole body breakdown in health. And that's basically what happened to me. And luckily, I was able to change my diet quite quickly, take some probiotics and so on, and really get myself up to a pretty reasonable state of health quite quickly. However, I needed to start thinking differently to do that. And I really needed to know myself and what was going on at a much deeper level than just thinking in a disease-oriented way. And more things happened along that journey that led me more and more to this concept of holism, if you like, and this concept of seeing individuals as a whole being, essentially, that they had really many layers to their illness. And it's interesting. It's almost like, and I think this is mentioned in The Matrix, the movie, the more you open your eyes and the more you start to see beyond the Matrix, the more it expands. Mm. And I found that's absolutely true, that the more one looks, the more one starts to see. And another phrase that often gets used is if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So that's a formula for one-dimensional thinking. However, if you've got a hugely diverse toolkit, then all of a sudden you start seeing the richness of life. And you see when people come in with depression, they can have a whole multitude of things going on. So that led me to starting my own medical practice in 2011 called Lotus Holistic Medicine, and doing a whole bunch of training with various people from around the world, including Gabriel Cousins and Richie Shoemaker and Dietrich Klinghardt and various others. And look, every day is just a new adventure, really, at this point. So I'm very, very blessed to be in this field of integrative medicine. So on that point, I might suggest we move on to answering some questions, Samantha, unless you had any other points you wanted to bring up at this point.
No, questions sound great.
Okay, so we had some questions that have been asked to us through the years, and particularly you, because you've been holding these kind of retreats for about how many years now?
Maybe about 4 years. So this is the first time, though, that we've done it as more of this integrative approach with, the medical side. And like last year, we were lucky enough to have you come and present a couple of hours, which was fantastic. But this one's quite unique, I think, that we're going to be doing much more of an integrative approach to our retreat.
Right. Yeah. So in the past, I gather you had focused quite a lot on the area of values around self-care and so on. And now I'm really excited about the synergy between that, what you're going to bring to the table through that that understanding and those ideas, and then really these ideas, from integrative medicine that, maybe there are a whole bunch of layers of things that are going on in your body that you can learn to understand and address, and together I think these two approaches that Samantha and I will bring together should give quite an amazing experience. So one of the first questions I was going to ask you, Samantha, is what are some small things that people maybe who are just not feeling 100% at their best, or maybe they're feeling a little bit stressed or anxious, what are some small things they can do to enhance their psychological health?
Absolutely. So the great thing now is there's so much research going on, particularly with this body and mind link. So one of the easiest things that people can do is just start to take a probiotic. To know that this interaction between the gut and the mind is so integral, and there's a lot of research supporting that if you can take a probiotic, the impact on depression and anxiety is significant. And just doing things, so we know about the vagus nerve, which connects the gut brain and the mind. And with this vagus nerve, we know if we can stimulate that, that's also going to assist us in relaxation. So some things that people can do is learning a mindfulness practice. That could be just being with the breath, breathing in, breathing out deeply, or it could be things like humming. So they know now that humming stimulates the vagus nerve, and so does gargling, which is a really quick, easy way that you can do that. So these are all evidence-based tools. The thing that you might want to also look at is starting to do some movement. So exercise has been a really well-researched area. So not only just going for a walk for 30 minutes, but we know now that diversity in how we move is essential. So you can run for 5 minutes at full pace, and with this, the research has shown that you can actually increase your lifespan by up to 5 years by just doing that intervention one time a week, running 5 minutes as fast as you can. So really looking at movement, but also rest. I think a big thing that you were saying, Sandeep, was that often in our culture, we get sick, we try and address that sickness really quickly, and then straight back into what we were doing. And I think that, we really need to learn to be able to stop and pause and be able to notice where we're at in that moment and make really good choices from that place. So rest and recovery is a really important thing that people need to do, whether that's increasing your sleep. A couple of, we know 8.5 hours of sleep is the gold standard. We know it's linked to a lot of improvement in psychological health, but also physical health. But, there's also research around if you can take 3 short naps a week, that can help you to, feel restored and your well-being enhanced. So we've got sleeping, eating. There's a lot of research now around diversity of what we eat with fruits and vegetables. Really being able to diversify treats that microbiome in your gut. So if we can start looking at diversification of food, but also how we eat. So there's a lot of thinking around eating behaviors. So if we can eat mindfully, not when we're stressed, because of course when we're stressed, it's not a time where we're meant to be digesting. So being able to stop and eat your meal, take time away from screens, computers, Facebook, social media. 2 other ones that I could probably share that are really quite easy and lots of research backs them is a gratitude practice. About maybe at the end of your day, 3 things over the day that you feel really grateful for. And they can be, simple things like the cup of coffee that the barista made you this morning, or watching the sunset at the end of the day. But how I encourage people to do this is to actually let your mind go back to that moment and experience it in a 5 senses way. So if I'm watching that sunset, notice the colours in the sky, notice my breath in that moment, notice where I'm sitting, being aware of what I can see, taste, touch, hear, smell. The reason for that is we're going to have much more of that experience, and we know that if we're being more grateful for things, it actually is linked to more pleasant emotions, but also a greater long sense of well-being. So gratitude is a big one. Mindfulness is a big one, as I mentioned before, or meditation practice. And probably the other one that's a little bit less well known is social connection. So loneliness, I don't know if you've seen that loneliness has been seen to be as problematic as diabetes as of late.
Okay, that it can actually, no, I haven't seen that research.
Yeah, so it's actually associated with 5 years less life expectancy if you're experiencing loneliness. And as I was saying before, with self-determination theory, feeling connected with people is a really big part of our general and overall well-being. So really noticing who you enjoy spending time with, who feels like it gives you energy, and that would be probably something that you could, plan in your week to make sure you have that social connection that's really meaningful for you.
Great, yeah. And interestingly, I noticed how you started off, with some simple physical things rather than, with starting with more psychological or mindfulness interventions. So I found that really interesting as a psychologist that, that you kind of think of the physical body as a really good place to start.
Yeah, I absolutely think that we need to start there. That when you're thinking about, getting to that place of self-actualization or best health, whether that's psychological or physical, we really need to start with the basics: what we're eating, what we're drinking, how we're moving, how we're resting, and how we're sleeping.
Yeah, I mean, those things have just such a profound effect. And I guess we've got to, at the end of the day, realize that the mind does have a physical component.
Absolutely.
I mean, the mind is, and it's very much linked to our physical body. So moving on from that, the other question I had was, what exactly, do you consider to be of value? And how do you find that understanding your values, or maybe knowing yourself in terms of your values, can help you maybe in some difficult situations in life?
So I think values for me have been the thing that I'm most passionate about, is helping people to get really clear on what their values are, because it can be such an anchor for people in tough situations. So if you think of a value like a direction, so if we think about like heading east, if we head east, we can never stop heading east. It's continual sort of movement forward. So thinking about a value is like identifying qualities or a way of being of how we want to be in the world. So if I think about a certain area of my life, like being the parent I want to be, thinking about qualities that link to who I want to be in that area. So I want to be a present mum who's loving, who's attentive. And the great thing about values is that we can never stop doing them. So as soon as I stop being loving and attentive, I'm not living my values anymore. So it's quite different to a goal, which is time framed, you tick it off. Values are something that can keep us really clear on where we want to head in our lives, but also being able to stop and go, who do I want to be right now? So if I think about my values in terms of, connecting with you, Sandeep, and the people who are listening, my values here are around being authentic, being generous with the information that I share, being open to feedback and questions. So in a moment, if I'm feeling a little bit anxious or I get lost, I can just ground myself with thinking about, okay, who do I want to be right now? And what would that look like? What would authenticity look like in this interaction? Or what would being present look like? So often when people get overwhelmed by a difficult feeling, or they're stuck in a difficult thought, being able to ground themselves with, right now, take a breath, take a mindful moment, and then get clear on what are my values in this area of my life and how can I live that right now. And that's a big part of the retreat, is getting clear on not only who you want to be as a health practitioner, but who do you want to be in the other, really important areas of your life, so that you're, having the life that you want. The other big thing about values that often people struggle with is, through our conditioning, values sort of seem like they're things that we should be doing. So I should be a loving mum. And we really want to move away from that. It's not about who we should be or who other people want us to be. It's really about who I want to be deep in my heart, and, what's going to bring me a sense of vitality. And we really can only explore that with like some experiential exercises to get under all that kind of learning that we've been conditioned to have, from family, from school, from society. So on the retreat, we do a lot of that sort of experiential work to help people really connect with what's meaningful and important to them.
Yeah, I actually found that to be quite valuable when I came along mainly as a participant last year. I did do a little session. But I think the thing for me was just focusing in on that. It was the simplicity of it in some way really appealed to me. And the practical application was just so obvious, really. So, yeah, just getting clear. So one of the things I've got really clear on this year is that one of my top values is around education, around holism and holistic medicine. And being clear about that, just it's made a big difference in terms of just knowing where I really want to go in my life, and being able to make more time for things like this retreat, opening my institute, which I've done just recently, and other little goals like that. It's almost like things naturally start to flow out of those values, don't they?
Absolutely. And that's the great thing, is that, once we're clear on our values, we can start setting goals that, take us in that direction. So, because goals are time limited, we might pick something off, like you've set up your institute, but because you're aware of your value around, okay, well, I still want to have this passion around integrated medicine, you can just keep setting goals that will keep taking you further and further.
Yeah, and that's really exciting to kind of feel like, hang on, I can actually create a life based on my own values. On some level, that is a bit of a revelation, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that, often in, life, we don't take stock of what's really important to us. And sometimes, going away on a retreat can be a really good way of doing that. Being able to sort of land somewhere different, not have the typical things that are in our day-to-day stuff that distracts us, and connect with ourselves and look at what really is important.
Yeah. And so, so just reflecting, I guess, on myself as a practitioner, I can identify different sort of motivations that I've had at different times. So for instance, one of the main motivations I've had was, just to simply meet others' expectations of me as a doctor, you could say, and play the role that others expect as a doctor. And while that sort of is a motivation, it hasn't been a very strong motivator for me, because I guess it's not really linked to who I am. However, then, I have at other moments, the motivation to be the best I can in this moment, and to educate, everything that I've learned, since being on this planet, and to really open up everything I've got in this consultation in this moment. And when that motivation starts coming in, it's just, for me, that's just a joy, because it's actually being present, it's showing up, and there's a life that flows through those interactions that's absent otherwise. So I wonder if you may be interested in talking a little bit about different types of motivation, and how that also, how that influences us, is the word I was looking for, as a practitioner.
Yeah, you could even see that when you were talking, Sandeep, that, when you were talking about, just being what other people needed you to be, your posture was quite small, your tone was much more monotone. And then when you started talking about, just being the best that you could be, your body language just opened up, you had this vibrancy in your face. And that is one really good indicator of when we're getting motivated by an internal motivation. So motivators can be sort of separated into external motivators or internal motivators. So external motivators are when we're doing something because we're going to either get something out of it, like a reward. So I might do this for money, or we're trying to avoid a punishment. So I'm going to do this, otherwise my partner's going to be really cranky at me. Another type of external motivator is doing things to avoid a difficult feeling. So I'm going to have to leave this party, otherwise I'm going to be anxious. So we're doing things to avoid a difficult or unpleasant emotion. So anything that we do that's driven by an external value is going to feel quite tight and a bit dead, a bit lifeless. And it's also not going to lead to long-term motivation. So often when people set, New Year's resolutions and things like that, part of the why they fail is this external reason that they set them up. Whereas internal reasons are quite different. So intrinsic motivation is when we do something just for the love of it. So, when you said before about you went for a walk on the beach and you had your green juice, they sounded like very just things that you enjoy and things that feel like meaningful to you. So doing things that we enjoy, or something that's linked to something very meaningful to us, even if it's hard, if it's connected to our sense of self, we're much more likely to be able to sustain our motivation in that way, which is why we need to make sure values are really linked to our sense of who we want to be and where we want to go, rather than someone else's. Otherwise, it's just going to fall in a heap, like all the news resolutions out there that don't work.
Have you ever done that yourself, by the way? Set a New Year's resolution that falls flat?
Oh, I'm pretty sure that I may have, like, before I did all this research on this stuff. Now I don't set them. I just try and just set goals outside of just the New Year's time.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's interesting. And did you have some questions as well, Samantha?
Yeah. So some of the things that have come through for you when we've been sort of looking at the retreats from people. So what might be some of the simple things that people can do to help their physical constitution?
Yeah, well, I think you already started covering this. And interestingly, you can kind of start at any, you can actually approach it from any side. It's not like there's one right or wrong answer. Like, you can approach it from a totally spiritual point of view and say, well, actually, meditation or prayer is what I need to do to improve myself on a physical level, because that will definitely filter down to having an effect on the physical level. Or some of the things that Samantha already talked about, such as gratefulness or gratitude practice and mindfulness. Well, are they just going to have an effect on the psychological realm? Well, no, they're absolutely going to have an amazing effect on the physical realm. So as I say, it's really a matter of starting wherever you feel there's an entry point, in my view. And again, I think it links to the motivation idea. Start where there's the most motivation. Where did I start? I actually started with meditation. So when I was in medical school, first year med student, very chaotic life at college, my main thing was to try and gain a bit of understanding of what am I actually doing on the planet? Why am I here? And so my entry point into holism was actually seeking spirituality. And I started reading the books of the UQ philosophy and spirituality section with this ravenous hunger to just get some understanding, because I felt so lost. And I felt, even though, you could say I was in this very high achieving area of study, I didn't feel a sense of general overall meaning. So as I say, I started that way as an entry point, but you could just as easily start on a purely physical realm, feeling like, okay, well, if I'm not feeling so great, the simple thing that where a lot of people would start is, well, let's have a look at what I'm putting in my mouth first. I mean, that's common sense, right? What happened to that? So that's a very, very common sense approach. And every culture of the world, I know David Wolfe, who's been one of my mentors, has pointed out that every culture, anywhere in the world, have the saying, you are what you eat. Yeah. And it's such an obvious truism, isn't it? What you put in your body is certainly going to have a massive impact on what sort of output you get out of it, or how you feel inside your body. And so starting there is also a brilliant thing. So, for me, let's say if I was eating Cocoa Pops for breakfast and going to McDonald's at lunchtime. Actually, I had a patient once called Mr. McDonald. I don't know if I told you about this, Sam, but I said, what do you eat? And he said, McDonald's. This is a true story. And so if you're like that, if you can just start there, and the really simple thing is just start preparing your meals yourself, or bring one of these in. So this is my beetroot, celery, and cucumber juice with ginger. If you can, that's actually a really simple place to start. If you're a bit embedded in terms of your diet, is start adding in a vegetable juice regularly, and that will just bring in a whole bunch of phytonutrients into your diet that will start to have an effect on your body. So phytonutrients means nutrients that come from plants, And the studies have really shown that they're probably the most powerful things in terms of actually activating our anti-aging gene programs, activating our anti-illness system. So we all have an anti-illness system in us. So if you look at this green juice, this is going to have compounds like resveratrol and isocyanides and various other phytonutrients. And just bringing that in will already start to change my preferences and my taste for food. Maybe I won't feel like McDonald's anymore. And slowly, if you can just bring more and more good stuff in, it tends to then crowd the bad stuff out. And that tends to be a really quite a good approach, because nobody likes deprivation mentality. Nobody wants to miss out. And therefore, you kind of don't want to get into that mentality so much. You want to get into the mentality where you're adding in amazing things. So I'm adding in this amazing veggie juice into today's diet, and it has definitely had a great effect. The other thing I've done is added in some vegetables. So if you can, for instance, add in a green salad somewhere that also has a variety of other colors in it, things like, carrots and beetroot, and all the different spectrum of colors have their own phytonutrients, and they all act to enhance your system, activate your system. So that's where I'd say for most people it's probably the simplest way to just start with just upgrading your physical health, is start adding some really good stuff in, and then you're not going to feel like eating McDonald's anymore, or even eating bread after a while. Because and this goes back to awareness, when you have the experience of feeling really good after a while, you start to then become more aware of what's not making you feel good. And so for a lot of people, eating white bread or any kind of, sugary foods, and even processed dairy products and artificial additives, all of those things are going to tend to just go out, because they're no longer congruent with your new model of health, which is actually whole food, whole food diet. So the more and more you bring that in, the more the other things go up. And if you slip up somewhere on the way, you just don't worry about it. You just keep going. So that's my basic little rave about how you can get started on this. And at this point, I'd like to also mention, if participants have any questions, there is a live chat here, and we're starting getting a few comments here. So Michelina says, great tips. We've got a Bugyesh Yadav saying hello. So if you guys have any questions, just add them into the live chat window, and we'll try and answer those along the way. Were there any other questions you had, Samantha, that you wanted to?
Yes. What was one of the other ones? So there's been a question around epigenetics. So it's such an important area at the moment, and the more we're learning about it. Do you want to give people a really simple explanation of epigenetics so that they can just get their head around it?
Sure. I believe the biggest lie, and maybe I shouldn't use the word lie because lie implies that there's bad intent behind it, but I think the biggest kind of thing that we need to overcome, or understanding that we need to move past in conventional medicine, is the idea that genes are your destiny.
Absolutely.
So genetic determinism would say that essentially I've got a certain amount of genes. There's a whole bunch of Parkinson's disease in my family, so therefore I should enjoy my life to the best until Parkinson's catches up with me, in 0.5 to 0.6 likelihood probability points, and if I escape it, I'm hugely lucky, and I should thank my genes, and maybe I didn't end up getting that gene. And so really it takes us down to just being a probabilistic scenario based on which genes we've inherited from our previous generations, and that basically we're simply, that's our destiny. Well, epigenetics essentially says, whoa, hang on a moment here. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Yes, we have a deck of cards that we're given at birth, which is our DNA, which is basically, it's basically like our hardware which we have running on our computer. But then there is a whole interaction between our life and our deck of cards. Okay, so I don't know if any of you play poker here, but sometimes you may have had the experience in poker that you have a very poor set of cards, but you throw a couple of them in, and then all of a sudden the next cards you get are pretty reasonable, and all of a sudden you have a reasonable hand. So what we're meaning to say here is that, you know, it's not all based on your original deck of cards that you start off with in the poker game. You can influence that deck of cards by the way you live. And that's what really epigenetics means. Epigenetics means you can turn on or turn off certain genes in your body. And it's not that you're getting rid of those genes, you're turning on their expression. So a DNA on its own and genes on their own don't actually do anything biologically. It's only when they're written into mRNA and then written into proteins that they then have a biological effect. And that whole process is very much influenced by our lifestyles. So going back to this idea of my red vegetable juice over here, which I talked about, and all its phytonutrients, basically, that just having that vegetable juice right now is having an epigenetic effect on which of my genes are expressing in this moment and which are not. So, for instance, we know that if you're having beetroot, there's a whole bunch of genes around nitric oxide, which is like a compound that keeps our blood vessels healthy, that will start to express, and we'll have much healthier gene expression around our blood vessels. So the same thing is there in many different facets of life. If we do mindfulness meditation, that's going to activate certain genes. If we're doing a gratitude practice, we're going to activate certain genes and deactivate other ones. So that's really my definition of epigenetics, is that it's the interaction of your lifestyle and your genes. And therefore, even though we may have certain weaknesses, which we, you know, and that goes back to our idea of knowing yourself. So I may have a genetic weakness perhaps around the neurological system. As I said, I've had quite a strong history of a family history of Parkinson's disease. However, I know that if I basically, you know, live a holistic lifestyle to the fullest of its expression, you know, in all likelihood, those genes are not going to express. I'm going to be able to keep them from expressing just through my, you know, through my lifestyle and diet and my holistic lifestyle on all levels. So I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right, Sandeep, that, you know, often, you know, we have family histories that are really difficult, but if the more we can know about those histories and then make choices based on how to stay well, how to stay healthy, and even just things like, you know, they've done meditation with people. So doing meditation has been shown to be able to switch off 1,000 problematic genes. So, you know, just these little differences, beetroot juices, whether it's, you know, removing gluten from your diet, whether it's being able to do more movement to reduce inflammation, we do have a lot of control over, you know, what happens in terms of our body and our well-being.
Great.
Is there any questions there, or do you have time for another question?
Yeah, we haven't got any questions so far. These guys are being really quiet. Maybe they're just stunned by the brilliance of our wit around the beetroot juice and so on. So let's jump to another one.
Okay. So can you talk to people a little bit about what pyrrole disorder is, and why is it important to know about it?
Okay, yeah, actually that's a really important one, because pyrrole disorder is something that is massively underappreciated, massively understudied, massively under-researched, massively undertaught, and massively important. Yeah. Is that enough massively?
But massively true.
But massively true. So pyrrole disorder is a condition where the body creates this compound, which was originally called cryptopyrrole, but has now been found that that is actually not what it is. It's actually better called hemopyrolactam. And but basically this compound has an unknown function. It gets formed during the process of red blood cell production. So as you probably know, hemoglobin is the red pigment in blood cells. And during the process of hemoglobin production, certain people create these compounds called hemopyrolactam as a byproduct. And basically, my suspicion is it's got some function. and the body's doing it as some kind of defense mechanism. But as a side effect of that, it tends to cause you to excrete too much zinc, vitamin B6, biotin, omega-3 acids, and a bunch of other things are affected as well, such as taurine and glutathione and other things. Now, why does that matter? Well, zinc is probably the single most important nutrient in the body. It affects every single enzyme of the immune system, or virtually every single enzyme of the immune system. It's vitally important for digesting your food. So if you're low in zinc, you do not have enough hydrochloric acid secretion in your stomach, and therefore you are not going to sterilize your gut and prevent yourself from getting parasites, firstly. Secondly, you're not going to break down protein properly if you do not have enough stomach acid. Thirdly, you're not going to absorb enough vitamin B12. And fourthly, you're not going to absorb enough minerals. So already we've got a major problem. And one of the minerals you're not going to absorb enough is zinc itself. So it becomes a vicious cycle. If you're low in zinc, you don't absorb zinc. It becomes lower and lower. And now another big thing about zinc is it's actually very important in terms of brain chemical formation. It's actually vital in the formation of serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline in the brain. So if you're low in zinc, you're going to tend to be sluggish in forming those happy chemicals, or serotonin particularly is considered to be one of the main happy chemicals. So vitamin B6 also acts along with zinc in many cases in the body, and also acts as a cofactor with magnesium in many cases. And if you're low in vitamin B6, again, you're going to tend to be low in serotonin. So therefore, there's a much higher rate of depression in people who have pyrrole disorder. And then what tends to happen when you become low in zinc and vitamin B6 is you tend to build up copper. So copper and zinc are like a seesaw. When one goes up, the other one goes down. So when zinc is going down and vitamin B6 is going down, copper tends to go up. That increases compounds such as adrenaline and noradrenaline in the brain, and you tend to be much more likely to get anxiety. So, you know, this is crazy. Could all simply just be due to this one little compound that we don't even know what it does being formed in the body. And therefore, if you can identify the fact that you are creating this compound of pyrrole, or pyrrolactam more accurately, and that can be done with a simple urine test, then all of a sudden you can just put in place a strategy which is supplementing with zinc, vitamin B6, biotin, and there are other things that are often supplemented as well. But very quickly, you can antidote that little weakness in your body. And I have actually found that to probably be the single most effective thing in holistic medicine. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling how effective it is and how underappreciated it is. So I think that's a super important thing. And I actually I can't stop myself from mentioning this on pretty much every webinar I'm on. And you'll know I did one recently with psychiatrist Mary Ackerley. And at the end, I just had to jump in and say, we haven't talked about pyrrole disorder here. We're going to be doing the audience a massive disservice here if we do not talk about pyrrole disorder. So that's how important I feel it is.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, like just knowing that about myself, that's what was going on when I came back from that trip in Thailand, it was life-changing. And the great thing about it is once you know that that's going on, it's quite a simple way to intervene around that. You know, you're just really addressing those deficits that are going on and manage that. But yeah, I could definitely see how much of an impact having that had on my health and well-being, and just being able to shift that's been enormous, and very grateful for that. So yes, definitely educate people on pyrrole.
Yeah. So you what did you notice?
I think that when I was experiencing those sort of panic sensations, and I didn't know what was going on, and the sleeplessness and more of that sort of restlessness in my body, until I started taking the zinc and the B6, that just went away. And so I could really see that once the pyrrole was addressed, a lot of those kind of mental health symptoms that were going on, that I'd tried every single tool that I had to address, that wasn't going away, went away with treating that. So yeah, it was huge. Yeah. And, you know, zinc's an ongoing issue. I have to keep up my zinc, but just knowing that has been, you know, such an important thing for me.
Yeah, and again, we're going back to, this is about knowing yourself. This is about awareness. And so if you develop the understanding that, okay, I've got this little biochemical glitch, which is a term I like to use, then you can compensate for that. And then it's no longer a silent program that's running you.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're dealing with it rather than it running you. And I think that's quite an important principle, I think, in health and in psychology as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you could say the same thing with psychology, being aware of your own stories or the lens in which you see things. As soon as you're aware of that, you don't need to be run by that any longer. And so, yeah, a big part of the retreat will be looking at that as well, noticing what stories and, programs you're running and how to step back from those.
Great. So we've kind of hit 8 p.m. So do you want to maybe, Samantha, to talk a little bit more about, the retreat in Byron Bay at the end of October, maybe, and a little bit more about that? Or would you maybe like to do one more question, or how would you like to finish this?
Maybe we should just give them a little bit of information on the retreat.
Yep.
And if there's no questions, we might say goodbye for tonight.
Yeah, it's easy, hey?
That sounds good. So the retreat is in Byron. It's at beautiful Tallow Beach houses, right on the beach. So the beautiful thing with last year is that we could just wake up and walk out from our little cottages and go straight onto the beach and watch the sunrise. It was beautiful. So it's running from the 28th of October till the 2nd of November. All meals are included. We have movement practices, and that'll be a range of things from cardio. So I'm also a personal trainer, so we do cardio practices, but we're also going to do qigong and yoga so that people have some restorative practices. We do workshops each day looking at, how to connect with your values, your own meaning and purpose, and also looking at the program that you're running. So, are there things blocking you psychologically? How do you look at what your lens is, your beliefs that are sort of getting in the way for optimal health? And then, of course, Sandeep will be presenting half the content. So this year, my little boy is going to be down there with me. So I'm very grateful that Sandeep's going to be with me doing this retreat and running half of it. Being a new mum it's not as easy to run a whole retreat as I've done before. But I'm very excited that this retreat will be quite different, and the knowledge that you will be able to bring will be just life-changing for people. Is there anything you want to share about what you'll be running?
Yeah, I think, look, what I've talked about today is basically, it will be a continuation of that. And really, I'm going to delve deeper into this idea of really trying to develop a certain type of freedom in terms of health, or a sovereignty is a really good word. So you can't really get sovereignty on a physical level unless you know yourself and what's actually holding you back. And I'm going to talk a lot about levels of health that a lot of us may not have been able to reach in the past, and some of the things that are holding us back, particularly toxicity. We're living in an extremely toxic world. I recently was at Dr. Dietrich Klinghart's training. He's from Seattle, in America, and he's traveled the world. He's originally a German doctor and practiced holistic medicine for around 40 years. And one of the things he kept emphasizing is we've really got to come to terms with how much toxicity we're being exposed to. And we've really got to have a proper strategy for dealing with that on a daily level. And that applies to practitioners and non-practitioners, of course. So a lot of this will be general info. And so if you're not fully, a practitioner in the sense that Samantha and I are, that's not necessarily a bar to coming, and you can certainly send us an email, and we can see if we think it's appropriate. And especially people who are recovering from health problems and are starting to basically want to offer themselves to other people in some capacity. For me, that basically is a definition of being a practitioner, really. And so, I've talked about toxicity. The other thing I'm going to talk about a lot about is stealth infections or hidden infections, which is a very underappreciated area of health and medicine in my view. And, talk about the different different types of hidden infections that most of us have, and how we can identify them, how we can actually overcome them. So that includes parasites, it includes yeast and fungus, including mold. We're going to talk about bacterial infections of various types, including tick-borne infections, and that's a huge subject as well. We're going to talk about biochemical glitches. So we talk, pyrrole disorder, methylation is another huge subject. And I can tell you, for me, actually, this year, just realizing and understanding my own physiology and understanding that I had a block to methylation has actually allowed me to have a major breakthrough on my health journey and actually detoxify a whole bunch of mercury out of my system that I didn't even realize I had. So again, going into these different levels of subtlety in terms of your physical health can be quite amazing. And you can see this year, the things that I've been able to do, I believe, have been in some way related to the fact that I've made a bit of a health breakthrough. And now, I'm opening an institute, we're running various different events and so on. And so I guess that's the other side that I'd also like to get to, is what's the potential of each of us as a practitioner? What's the potential we can actually bring to each of these interactions and just into our life in the world? And more and more every day, I started this call off by saying it's a tremendous blessing to be a practitioner. And I want to emphasize that again and emphasize the fact that really, there is a lot of information out there that is not being taught at any school or at any university, anywhere. And if someone's going to teach it, it's going to be us. So why not join on board of this this train of holistic medicine education, where we can start getting the most recent information on health, which is going to benefit us as practitioners and everyone we come in contact with. So that was a long answer to a simple question, but that's pretty much what I hope to cover at the retreat.
Awesome. The other thing that you covered last year, which I'm hoping you will talk about, is also nutrition, which I know a lot of people got a lot out of last year as well. So I know that will probably be a big part of what we talk about.
Yeah, that's right. I remember one little subject which people found surprisingly helpful, and sometimes the most basic things are the most helpful, is just like tuning into the fact, are you the sort of person who tends to need a high protein diet or a high carbohydrate diet? And if you have one, what effect do you notice in your body? So if you eat fruit for breakfast, are you the sort of person who then feels great until midday, which is usually what we call a veggie type or a carb type? Or are you the sort of person who's chomping at the bit half an hour later and needs to have your eggs and bacon or whatever it might be, or you feel like you need something more strong just to be able to manage your blood sugars? Do you get lots of blood sugar ups and downs? So these are little simple questions that you can ask yourself, and it takes you back probably to the idea that diet's very individualized. So I'm not really going to just teach one diet. I'm more going to give basic principles. So I talked about plant nutrients today. I think that's a very, very important principle. But again, it's probably going to go into a variety of different ways in which you can learn to know whether what you're doing is working for you or whether you need to change. So I think those were some of the things that I covered last year.
Yeah, absolutely. So that mindful awareness of, what the impact of certain foods are and how to start tuning into your body. And so we can see, again, that mindfulness and knowing yourself really is this theme that's going to kind of go in and out through this retreat.
Great, excellent. So I think I've put the link for the retreat up in the YouTube live chat there. So if anyone wants to check it out, they can click through on that link. And is there an email address that we can give people if they want to ask any questions about the retreat or make any inquiries?
Sure. So they can email health@mindbodyresilience.com.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I hope everyone's got a lot out of this webinar today on knowing yourself on all levels, and hopefully you guys are inspired about this idea of holistic health, and really looking forward to this Practitioner Wellness Retreat in Byron Bay towards the end of October, and I'm really looking forward to seeing who's going to join us there, and of course everyone who comes becomes part of building, you know, the group energy and building the group vibe that makes every event as wonderful as it is. So yeah, I really hope that everyone's enjoyed this webinar, and yeah, we may run another one sometime over the next couple of months, depending on Samantha's travels. But we'll probably try to run one in another month or so, depending. Yeah. Does that sound like a plan?
That sounds good.
Okay, great. Any final words from yourself?
No, just thank you, and thank you to those that are listening. And if you do have any questions that we haven't covered, feel free to email those as well. And this will be up. We're going to put the chat that we've had up on probably both my website and Sandeep's website, so that you can check it out if you've missed anything or you want to go back and have another listen.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Samantha. And
thanks,
we'll talk soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.